What's up, everybody? My name is Dimitri Kofinas. I'm a media entrepreneur, financial analyst, and the host of Hidden Forces, a podcast that helps investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens get an edge by equipping themselves with the knowledge needed to anticipate the challenges and opportunities of tomorrow. By sharing my critical thinking approach and by challenging consensus narratives about the power structures shaping our world, I help you make the connections to see the bigger picture, empowering you to make smarter decisions. In this week's episode, I speak with Luke Burgis, founder and director of Fourth Wall Ventures and author of Wanting, a book about the power of mimetic desire and how it impacts our behavior in work and life. The goal of this conversation is to help you understand the forces that shape how we come to want the things that we desire, from fancy degrees to ambitious career goals to gorgeous bodies, and to learn how to extract ourselves from the systems of wanting that ultimately leave us exhausted. We're going to sift through the noise of consumer culture, social media, and political divisiveness to identify those desires that are meaningful and enduring. In the overtime, Luke and I discuss the mimetic consequences of social media and how the hyperconnectivity of modern life has fundamentally altered our perception of reality with dramatic implications for our political and economic systems. We also discuss how to counteract the destructive forces of mimetic desire so that rather than try and rid ourselves of them, we learn to desire differently. And with that, please enjoy this week's episode with my guest, Luke Burgis. Luke Burgis, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thanks for having me on.
It's great having you on. So is this your first book or did you co-author a previous book?
I co-authored a book called Unrepeatable with a really small little publishing house. So this is a totally different animal because I wrote this one myself. It's with a big trade publisher and it's for a broad audience. So
yeah.
It's quite a bit different.
Yeah, well, congratulations, because it's no small feat. The book is titled Wanting, the Power of Mimetic Desire in Everyday Life. Where did you get the idea to write a book like this?
I got the idea because I stumbled on René Girard, the French thinker. He was a mentor to Peter Thiel at Stanford in the late 80s and highly influential in academia, everything from literary criticism to sociology to history, which is actually where his background is in. And he just had some big ideas that really rocked my world. And I'd been immersing myself in his thinking and grappling with how does this apply to my life? How does this apply to the world for a really long time, to the point where I started going to these academic conferences, that a couple hundred people show up to, almost all academics. And then you get me, basically an entrepreneur, rolling in there. And I'm like, I'm really interested in this guy's ideas. And there was no books that made him accessible. He was kind of confined to this small academic community. He's not easy to read. He can be considered obscure. And I was showing up at these conferences. I was having a lot of conversations with people, and I couldn't find a good book to recommend as an introduction to mimetic theory and René Girard. And I just got to the point where I was like, I think I might have to be the one to write this book, because I sit at this weird intersection, right? I'm this entrepreneur, but I've studied philosophy, I've studied theology, I'm interested in ideas. And I sort of sit at this weird place where I think I could make some connections between Peter Thiel, between, the religious aspects of mimetic theory and financial markets. And it's kind of like having a baby or starting a company. You just got this fire in your gut and you're like, I can't not do this thing. It's driving me crazy. I couldn't sleep at night. So I decided to write it.
Yeah, totally. I get that. So help me. We don't have to spend too much time on this because I want to spend the vast majority of our time talking about the book, but help me understand the through line here, how you got from A to B. Was it Peter Thiel's work or his writings that introduced you to Girard? Sort of what was that whole path, and how were your early experiences as an entrepreneur influential in perhaps putting you on the path to seeking out this type of work? What were you looking for that you found?
Yeah, I was not.
And tell us a little bit about René Girard so that people who don't know who he is have some understanding while we go forward.
Sure. My introduction to René Girard did not come through Peter Thiel. I learned his connection much, much later, but I'll get to that because the way that I was introduced to Girard, I think, is kind of interesting. Let me back up. So My experience as a young startup entrepreneur was wild roller coaster ride. I graduated from NYU Stern. I worked on Wall Street for a very short period of time. And then I left and moved to California and started a company with my cousin in LA. I never lived in Silicon Valley. I lived in a little apartment in Hollywood when I started my first company. And in the course of my 20s, I ended up co-founding 4 companies. I had some success with the first one. I had one blow up. I walked away from one. I was all over the place. But in my late 20s, I ended up with this like crazy conglomerate situation. Like you should have seen, like I mapped out, which of these companies owned what on a piece of paper. I went to a lawyer one day because I had split up with my business partner, and he took one look at this and he was like, "Dude, how old are you?" And I was like, "I'm 27." He's like, "Man, you have to simplify your life."
How did you manage your taxes? How did you? Did you also have like an accounting degree, or was your accountant like your family member?
I did. I double majored in finance and accounting at Stern. So but I mean, I didn't use it, right? It was just brutal. So this lawyer was like, "Dude, you have to simplify your life, man." And and I had done well financially, and I had some freedom because I had some successes. But what I'd realized is like I would start something and go down this path and be super passionate about it and then be disillusioned with it or lose interest in it a very short period of time later. And I was just kind of bouncing from one thing to another. And I got to a certain point where I was like, man, I don't really want to do this for the rest of my life. Like, at some point I want to be married. I want children. So I had this like, I guess you could call it a quarter life crisis where I was like, I just need to like take some time away and figure out, what's going on. Like I have all of the things that I thought would make me happy, like all the things that, a successful entrepreneur is considered to have. Yet I just am not even close to being satisfied. I'm like more miserable than ever. So I resolved to take a little sabbatical and step away. And, that led me, I thought that sabbatical was going to be like 3 months or something like that, where I would go on vacation, go to a beach in Thailand, take a bunch of good books with me and do a bunch of reading that I didn't do in high school and, refresh my soul a little bit and then come back and start another company or something like that. But it turned out that I need a lot longer than that. And it was during that period of time when I was introduced to René Girard. And I was actually on a silent retreat in the hills outside of Rome, Italy. And I went on this retreat. There were like a bunch of monks running it. It was at a monastery. And in the course of the retreat, so the whole thing was silent with the exception of 30 minutes a day, where you meet with a retreat director or somebody who's guiding you through the retreat. And you just talk about what's going on. And this guy turned out to have been a Girardian or somebody who was fascinated with René Girard. And he was trying to help me to understand that a lot of the things that were going on in my life had to do with mimetic desire, which is Girard's big idea, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But he really just like opened my eyes to this hidden force that was operative in my life, and I just hadn't seen it, right? It's like what had been driving me. And then, that hidden force I ended up seeing all over the place. I saw it in the culture, I saw it in politics, I saw it in the financial markets. So he opened my eyes to this idea of mimetic desire, which has all kinds of implications and consequences. Mimetic desire has to do with rivalry, it has to do with conflict and violence and scapegoating. And there's a thread that we can draw to all of those things. But let me just answer your question about who René Girard was, because I think he's a fascinating figure, and we don't see many people like this anymore. So Girard was a Frenchman who came to the U.S. shortly after World War II and settled at Indiana University. He didn't get tenure. He wasn't publishing enough, age-old problem. So he bounced around. He went to Johns Hopkins. He eventually ended up at Stanford, where he was for most of his career, or he was the mentor of Peter Thiel. And Girard was a real fascinating thinker because he was an autodidact. He was extremely interdisciplinary. His PhD was in history, but he was fascinated by literature, by theology, by philosophy, and was just this, you don't see a lot of people like that, right? And this, like, everybody's like hyper specialized now, but Girard had just drunk deeply from all these different wells. And he had this fundamental insight of mimetic desire in the late 50s and early 60s. And he published his first book, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, where he explained fundamentally like the nature of human desire and how it works. And he had noticed something that nobody had really noticed before.
So there are a lot of things that you said in your answer, the totality of your response, which I'd like to maybe touch on in the overtime. You talk about a quarter-life crisis. Man, can I relate to that? You know? And I think a lot of people can, especially people that are very ambitious. You know, your 20s are a difficult period because, and this, I imagine this has become even more difficult in the world we live in today, Luke, than when you and I were coming up, because you and I actually would just discover we both went to NYU at the exact same time. And this has to do because of social media and hyperconnectivity. People, the sort of Celebristan has become Freshmanistan. You know,
Exactly.
we'll talk about that. So you mentioned Peter Thiel. I'd like to flesh out that connection as well, because I'm curious. I had no idea just how influential René Girard had been to Peter Thiel. Did you find in speaking to Peter, because you actually interviewed him for this book, did you find that his rationale, the entry point for him was the same, and the impact? Because one of the things I found interesting was how Peter, and this isn't from your book, I think I actually listened to Peter in a separate interview talk about this, where he said that sort of the impact of reading Girard was, first, his initial reaction was not to believe it. It was almost like this disillusionary to believe that all of the things that he wanted, or so much of what he actually wanted, were not his own wants, that he was simply mimicking, he was pulling from the environment. So what was that connection with Peter Thiel, and did you find that there was a similar thread in how he came to this, to Girard's work, with how you came to it?
Yeah, I find there's two very typical reactions to René Girard and mimetic theory when people are introduced to it. One is, oh, there's no way that this is true. There's no way that imitation is that pervasive, or it's just obscure and people just dismiss it. Or they dismiss it for the opposite reason, and they say, well, that's obvious. Of course, like, we want things because other people want them, right? Isn't that what advertising is all about? And then they miss all of the nuance. So it's like one of these two things, right? And there's this vast like middle ground to explore, and all of the nuance in that. So I think Peter's first reaction, from what I understand, was, this can't be true. You know, there's no way that this could be true. But his intellectual curiosity, you know, caused him to go deeper. And his experience with it was very much like my own. He was on a hypermimetic track in college, and then post-college, went to law school, was in finance, just a lot in common with both of us, actually, with you and I, from what I know. And was on this hypermimetic track and was kind of looking for some kind of a mental model to explain why he was doing some of the things that he was doing. And Girard helped him make sense of that. But that came later. So like first, Girard gave him insights into things that were happening in the culture. He gave him insights into the Judeo-Christian tradition and the scriptures, which Peter was looking for. He had always been grappling with religion and looking for sort of more of a rational explanation for why humans are religious and the uniqueness of the gospel stories and the Bible. And he found that in Girard, because this is part of René Girard. He explaining the roots of the sacred and religion is a big part of mimetic theory. And Peter began to notice all around him how mimetic people were, how mimetic our culture is in financial markets. And later, like me, he began to sort of see it in himself, because when you first learn about this, I think it's relatively easy to spot mimetic behavior, herd mentality in markets and in politics and things like that. And you sort of think, maybe it's just our pride, that other people are like this, but I'm not. And then when you actually go deeper, you do some self-examination, you realize that you have some of these tendencies and impulses in yourself. And then it becomes existential and it becomes real. So for Peter, it was a two-part movement, exactly like it was for me. I started to see it in everywhere but myself. It's what I call my oh shit moment, like, oh shit, like this is a thing that's real and it's all over the place. And then I had, my holy shit moment came when I saw it in myself, and I saw it in my own relationships, right? With my girlfriend, with other people in my life. And I saw how those mimetic dynamics that Girard had described were operative.
So give us some of those examples, if you don't have any that are too personal that you want to share, and use that as an opportunity to explain in the simplest terms possible what mimetic desire is.
Mimetic desire is wanting what other people want because they want it. And it's really a totally different way of understanding human desire in a way that is relational. So like desire is generated in the relationship between people rather than generated individually or autonomously or independently, which is really, when you get down to it and you really ask people why they want the things that they want, their explanation is always highly individualistic, as if there's like a direct line between them and the things that they want. And I think this kind of a product of this hyper individualistic age that we live in. And we kind of deny our interdependency. And Girard actually coined this term that we're not individuals, we're interdividuals, because desire itself is interdividual. It kind of exists in this space between people. I mean, just to use a very simple example, to go all the way back to like the story of Genesis, the fruit in the garden was never desired until the desire to eat the fruit was suggested by the serpent.
Right.
So like the desire just doesn't come out of anywhere. It's not spontaneous. And that was Girard's insight, that human desire is not spontaneous. And that if you look hard enough, because we're social creatures, we rely on models for our desire. Like desires are suggested to us and they're modeled to us by other people, by groups, by the culture, by all kinds of things. And we need models of desire. We rely on models of desire. Now, that's different than needs. So this is not to say that if I'm dying of thirst in the desert, I need, to see a model of somebody drinking in order for me to realize that I'm thirsty. I don't need models for that because, I'm biologically wired to seek water when I'm thirsty or to seek warmth when I'm cold. But we live in a world now where there's like less and less of a focus of, staying warm and just getting enough food to eat and fulfilling our basic needs. And now kind of really for the first time in human history, most people are coping with abundance. So we've kind of we've went from this world of being very focused on survival and on fulfilling, what I would call things more in the realm of needs, to this universe of desire, where like 99.9% of the things that we want are not things that we necessarily need. I would classify them as desires. So mimetic desire is more important to understand than ever. And when I looked back at my life, it was very clear to me that I had models for everything that I had done in my career and in my life, from wanting to go to New York City to go to college. I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan. And from wanting to go to a very specific college to the kind of job that I wanted when I graduated. As much as I tried to find hyper rationalistic explanations for those things. And it's not that I didn't have them. It's not that going into investment banking, there were not financial rewards, because there were. I mean, it was the highest paying job that I think I could have got when I graduated from Stern. But the illusion, the romantic lie, is that that's the only reason that I wanted to do that, or that it was the smartest thing to do or something like that. Not remembering that when I went to college, I wanted to be a doctor. So like what happened in the 4 years that I was in college that made me like totally, I was surrounded by people in New York that wanted to go into finance, and that's fine. But we just often deny like the social forces that are shaping our desire. So I saw that in my life.
So I have a bunch of questions here. I was trying to think this through and understand sort of what drives this, and how much of a mimetic desire is just a side effect of empathic behaviors that we evolved for purposes of survival. How much of it is a result of competing for the purposes of mating? Great example is investment banking. There are benefits to being an investment banker in 2004 in New York City, right? When it came to the dating scene, i.e. making money, but also just being an investment banker, because that signaled something. It signaled you were part of an in-group, you were successful. And how much of this is just a heuristic for learning, like mimetic learning, right? This is how babies learn. They look at what you're doing, how you pick up a bottle. They pick up a bottle the same way so they can learn how to drink themselves. Obviously, your toddler's not going to learn how to drink from a bottle, but you get what I'm saying. So what is the sort of pathway that Girard identifies and that you think is the sort of cause for this phenomenon, which is so widespread and pervasive?
I think there are certainly evolutionary developments that led to this kind of behavior. I mean, Girard would even say that the human powers of mimesis were part of the process of hominization, part of the process of humans becoming humans in the first place, is that we basically developed a mimetic brain in a sense. Like we somehow learned to imitate better than our ancestors did. And that has powerful evolutionary implications. So, imitation, mimesis is the basis, the foundation for learning. As you said, it's how we learn language. It's how we build all culture, essentially, is through imitation. It's how we sort of like trace culture through time and space, right? By imitating what came before us, cultural norms. And, it's the basis of relationships too. So this is a tremendously positive thing, or at least ambiguous. Like we have this faculty, this powerful faculty of imitation, and it's clearly contributed to our development. It's definitely probably contributed to how we find mates. I mean, like people that aren't able to imitate well are like awkward and have a hard time, right? You have to be able to like engage in this.
That was something that came to mind when I was reading the stuff about Peter, because Peter I think he has Asperger's. He certainly talked openly about some of his challenges around empathy and emotion, and I think he's actually had to learn certain techniques to be able to convey or understand other people's emotions. So I wonder, that's a separate point, but I wonder maybe we can get back to it, how maybe his understanding of that aspect of this was different than, say, yours. Mm-hmm. But I interrupted you. I was asking, so we talked about the evolutionary benefits, which would encompass heuristics for learning and empathy, relationship building, and competition for mates.
Right. So Girard's, I think, fundamental point is that imitation can spiral out of control and lead to extremely negative consequences. So despite all of these positive benefits that it has, it can also lead humans to do some pretty stupid and irrational things and lead to basically self-destruction. Peter, I don't want to get sidetracked on this, but you're right. Peter's talked a lot about this and written about like neurodiversity in Silicon Valley and how people with Asperger's, for instance, may have some kind of competitive advantage or be able to innovate or not get stuck in zero-sum competitive games because perhaps they're less mimetic or less imitative of the people around them that are just kind of flocking to the same things. That's a fascinating discussion in and of itself. I'll table that for now, unless you want to come back to it. The Girard's insight was that imitation has a dark side. And this is different than other people that have talked about imitation, like Richard Dawkins and meme theory, where imitation only seems to be positive, right? Like we replicate things so that they can survive. Girard saw that with human imitation, there's a real dark side. And it's a very logical progression to me. If we are imitating somebody else, if we want what somebody else wants and we start pursuing the same thing, whether that's a mate or a job or a status or whatever it is, class warfare. If we want what somebody else wants, we de facto become their rivals. We sort of start to view them as standing in our way and enter into zero-sum games with other people. And I think it's easy to understand how this goes to society by just understanding it at the micro level. We can become obsessed with other people that we take as our models of desire. And it can just lead us to do really stupid things, like to the point where like I've taken this person as my model. And, Girard says the reason that we do this is because all desire is metaphysical desire. Like all desire is a desire for being that we feel like we lack. So we imitate other people who we think have something that we don't have, with the idea that, if we're just able to get it, that we'll acquire some quality of being. Okay. That we realize it never actually brings that with it when we get it. So we just have to always go in search of other models. But because we think that these other people have something that we lack, they're basically become rivals to us. And, we engage in rivalrous behavior, which eventually can become destructive, lead to conflict, or just complete misery and depression when we don't realize that we're kind of locked into these games with other people, locked into rivalry, which, if we think about it, usually doesn't really have a defined finite end to it. And that mimetic desire is the root cause of conflict in human culture, in our lives. And we don't really think of it that way. Like, we don't think that it's because we want the same things that that causes tension. We think that it's because we're so different, not that we've come to want the same things. So that single discovery, I think, of Girard, which, plays out in 1,000 different ways, is just the flip side to it. So I think it's useful to look at mimetic desire as this part of the way that human beings are, and it leads to positive things and it leads to negative things.
What are the metaphysical roots of mimetic desire, and what role did religion and existential questions play in René Girard's formulation of it?
They were huge. René Girard was a devout Roman Catholic, and I think he'd spent a lot of his life, probing these questions, right?
His father was an atheist, right? But his mother was religious?
His father was, I don't know if he was an atheist, but he certainly wasn't religious.
He was a materialist?
Yeah, I think probably be fair to describe him along those lines, but I'm not entirely sure. I think his father was, kind of your French intellectual curator of a museum. I'm not entirely sure. Cynthia Haven, by the way, wrote an excellent biography on Girard called Evolution of Desire. And I'd have to revisit it to make sure. I don't want to label him because I don't know what he was. I'm really not sure. But I don't think his parents were very religious. Girard had a pretty serious conversion experience later in his life while he was at Johns Hopkins. So I think these questions were always driving him. And he was trying to understand violence and get at the religious roots of violence and answer questions like, is religion violent, for instance? And, these metaphysical questions played a huge role for Girard. And I think it's easy to look at mimetic desire as kind of to explain the stock market, or to explain, why people move in crowds and why there's mob behavior and things like that. And that's kind of a starting level. But as Girard got older, he realized that there were a lot of metaphysical and theological implications to what he was saying. Like, where does desire come from in the first place? Why are human beings never satisfied with anything that they can acquire? And this is where he kind of formulated his concept of metaphysical desire, that all desire is kind of this desire for being. And we can often look for that in all the wrong places.
The desire for being. Talk about that.
Yeah, it's a desire for some fullness of being that we feel like we lack. And in, traditional Judeo-Christian theology, that fullness of being can only be found in God. And I think one of the ways that Girard would explain mimetic desire is that it's a search for transcendence. Like, all desire is in some sense transcendent. If it wasn't, there would be no desire at all. It's always for something that's beyond what we already have, right? And that mimetic desire and mimetic rivalry is always latching on to something that we think will fulfill us, that is transcendent to us. And those things or those models can easily become idols to us. And that the only way to completely kind of get out of the traps of mimetic rivalry that end in conflict between human beings is a renunciation of that kind of mentality, and kind of an acceptance that, we'll only find this in God, or in an acceptance of that ultimately desire is for something, beyond this world. And that when we try to find it here, it inevitably leads to tension and to conflict and to war and perpetual.
I'm fascinated by this. Is that another way of saying that there is conflict between what is in our heads and what we feel, what we experience when we're fully, truly present? Is there something there? Because one of the things that I thought about while reading the book was what impact ridding ourselves of this desire would have on industriousness and creation and creativity. I feel a lot of times creation is the byproduct of conflict and sometimes suffering that comes from that conflict of wanting and not having and manifesting. Speak to that a bit.
Sure. So Girard would say that the modern market economy, for instance, is the first time in human history that we have had a social innovation that has allowed humanity to channel a mimetic desire and mimetic rivalries in positive ways that lead to, wealth creation and innovation. And that's like one of the marvels of the modern market economy.
So a non-zero sum way of channeling this desire.
Right. So, we've somehow like found a way. So if you accept the premise that we're mimetic, rivalrous creatures that tend towards competition, basically, no matter what, we tend towards this. The modern market economy has found a way to make competition, tremendously like fruitful. We have a system where, the people that are creating the most value are rewarded. People that don't eventually, go bankrupt, and they're forced to do something else. The market signals value, and the rivalry in essence, we've found a way to make it have a useful signaling function, to tell us where we're adding value and where we're not. Of course, the market produces its own victims in a different way, right? I mean, those who don't have access to markets are kind of, sacrificed in a sense. That'd be one way to say it. But the market economy is in essence a way to channel mimetic desire, is one way that Girard would put it. So a lot of innovation comes out of mimetic desire and rivalry. I tell the story in the book about, Ferruccio Lamborghini going into the car business because he was in a rivalry with Enzo Ferrari. And it led to the creation of, these beautiful machines. And it never would have happened unless he'd had this mimetic desire to kind of one up his rival, Enzo Ferrari, and that's a great example of how that works. So, I think there's definitely positive aspects of that, but there's a sacredness to the market. The market and the economy does have kind of this sacred quality. And Girard sort of realized that all systems of exchange have religious roots. If you look back to where all of the early coins were found in world history, they were found near temples and religious sites of worship. Why? Because the people went there and they had to sort of buy animals for religious sacrifice. So, his hypothesis would be like that the invention of money was for religious rites and religious purposes because people needed animals to sacrifice at the temple. And sort of, so there's kind of religious roots even to the economy. And we often separate those things and think of the economy as being its own vehicle. But in Girard's view, there's like this religious sacred dimension to everything, including economics. And I sort of wonder, you see this with Bitcoin and crypto, right? Like there does seem to be this religious sacred dimension to the market that we don't talk about a lot.
You're speaking to the choir on that one. I've talked about that quite a bit. So money bought you catharsis. And one of the things I didn't know until I read your book was the origins of the term scapegoat. So it actually derives from the sacrifice of animals as part of this overall cycle of creation and destruction, this mimetic cycle. Explain that to me.
I think the etymology of the word scapegoat is important to talk about a little bit. So we talked about these coins were found near these temple sites because people wanted to go sacrifice animals. And by sacrificing the animals, as you said, they experienced some sense of catharsis. The most famous ancient rite was on Yom Kippur. So in ancient Israel and Jerusalem, the high priest would come before all of the people. They'd gather around the temple in Jerusalem, and he'd have two kid goats. And the rite worked like this. One of these two goats, this is a very mysterious rite, by the way, would be sacrificed to God as a sacrificial offering. The other goat was far more interesting. The other goat, he would symbolically pray. Remember, Yom Kippur is the one time of the year where sins are purified completely. And the way that it worked is he'd pray over this kid goat and symbolically transfer all of the sins of the people onto this one goat. And then collectively, everybody would drive this goat out into the wilderness to a demon, Azazel, who lived in the wilderness. And the goat would, presumably die. And as the goat went out and as the goat, went to die in the wilderness, so did their sins. So the people felt this tremendous sense of catharsis. They came together. There's unification. So imagine people in the community have been quarreling or been in some rivalries. All of a sudden they come together and they're standing side by side, putting both of their sins onto this goat and then together driving the goat out into the wilderness. It's unifying, it's cathartic, and it brings some temporary peace until, of course, they have to do it all over again the very next year, right? So that second goat that escaped is where the word scapegoat eventually came into the English language in the 16th century. When the Hebrew term for that goat was translated into English as scapegoat, you could think of it like the goat that escaped, okay? Scapegoat. And Girard found that behavior has been present throughout human history, that need to basically purify ourselves and find catharsis through some kind of a sacred rite that produces a victim.
It's fascinating. And I wonder how much of it is, even the case of Nazi Germany and Hitler and the Second World War, anti-Semitism was prevalent throughout the world, and it was prevalent in the United States as well. The Americans won the war. They didn't vanquish anti-Semitism, but by perhaps, it isn't just with anti-Semitism. I use this because it's a good example, but generally speaking, so many of the ills associated with World War II and Nazi Germany, and it wasn't just Nazi Germany, you had fascist Italy, were in the collective culture retold in a very simplified way. It was Hitler, he was bad, and everyone got drunk and we're over it. And I wonder how much of it is that it's too complicated to deal with all the nuances and subtleties related to this sort of stuff. And so we have to find very easy ways to reconcile and move forward. What is the thinking behind why we do this, why we need scapegoats, why we need witches to stone?
Girard thought that all mythology kind of sprung up as a way to cover up our own violence or to cover up what was really happening, to cover up the scapegoat mechanisms. And I think that's actually really, really fascinating, right? We always need stories that absolve us of any role in the mechanism. So, take the 2008 financial crisis. Like there's always this, in my opinion, there's this really oversimplified story that's told. And it's just like, there were these few bad actors, right? A few people on Wall Street, that were responsible. there was all kinds of really complicated, interconnected things going on there, right?
Yeah.
And, Girard noticed that we often use very interesting language to describe this stuff, right? Like language from natural disasters. Like there was this avalanche of debt, or, we got hit with a tsunami of this political wave or whatever. And his theory was this is mythological language, basically. Isn't it interesting that we use those kinds of words to simplify what was really happening? And it's usually what he would call mimetic crises of our own making. And he explored myths throughout history and found that if you get underneath the myths, there was always probably some real violence that happened. And the myth is just a covering up of the violence. So he goes back to this founding story of Rome with these two twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, and they fought over where the city was going to get built, and one killed the other one, and that even is what he calls a founding myth, and it's meant to cover up some violence, right? That was at the heart of that. There may have been some war in the city, right, where two rival political factions were fighting, and when the story is retold, it's sort of projected onto these mythological figures. There's this easy narrative to follow, and it's just a way to kind of not actually deal with the consequences of our own violence. And he saw this repeated throughout history. I think we can even see that in our modern day, right? It's going to happen probably going to happen with the pandemic. Are we going to need a scapegoat? Because the problem with the virus is that so part of the scapegoating ritual was that people, there's a ritual involved, right? The prayer needs to happen. People need to drive the goat out. They need to see the goat going. And unfortunately, scapegoats became, humans. The Greeks had a process for this. They called it the pharmakos, not the scapegoat, where they would flagellate a person, some outsider, and then throw them off of a cliff. We've always done this. The problem with the virus is like, we can't flagellate it and, watch it die and, and achieve some level of catharsis from that, right? It's just going to end up, if enough people get vaccinated and we deal with it the right way, right? Like it's going to go away. Like, will we experience the catharsis or not? Or will we need to find a scapegoat, right? Like somebody to blame to experience what we need to experience in order to move on. I don't know.
Well, I have a question about that. So during the Trump era, that was ostensibly Donald Trump, at least certainly among progressives. Today, it seems like the scapegoat is lining up to be China, especially as theories around the lab leak hypothesis become more bipartisan. 60 Minutes did a piece on it. Anthony Fauci, who was strongly against it, now is beginning to raise doubts about the origins of the virus, et cetera. And that raises the larger question of geopolitics, because, of course, these forces have shown up on the international stage in the past, and they'll continue to do so in the future. Do you look at geopolitics? Do you look at foreign affairs? Do you look at international relations and look for examples of how this is playing out on the world stage?
I think it's important to keep this in mind on the national political level and in the international one in geopolitics. I mean, part of my hope for writing this book is just that we have more of awareness of how these things work, like what the scapegoat mechanism is. It was part of Girard's theory was like the only reason that it works is that we don't know we're participating in it. Like if we think that we're making a scapegoat, well, then it's not the scapegoat mechanism. It doesn't work like that. Like the part of the precondition for it working is that we know that we're not doing it, or that we don't think that we're doing it, excuse me. So I think just being aware that we have a tendency to do this is important, and seeing when we're doing it as a nation, when we're doing it as a community, and when we're doing it in our personal lives, quite frankly, in our workplace or something like that. I think it's really important. So yes, I think that mimetic desire and rivalry is a very important and useful frame to look at geopolitics. Most countries kind of need an enemy. I mean, some countries start war, quite frankly, in order to wag the dog or to divert attention from problems at home. And I think we've got to be very, very careful about doing that. So I think right now, China seems to be, the focus of our attention. And I don't know where that's going to lead. I mean, I think we should find out where the virus came from, but that's different than sort of escalating rhetoric and contagion that leads to, precipitous kind of consequences. And we're in an interesting place right now where the tide has kind of changed. We're having this conversation when there's been renewed interest in that hypothesis. So at what point does that become scapegoating? I'm not sure.
It's interesting. And again, I don't want to push you on a subject that maybe isn't your particular cup of tea or not, but we've covered China quite a bit. And one of the things that I've come to believe is that the United States needs a whole of government approach to dealing with the Chinese Communist Party that ultimately leads to strategic competition, which is effectively another way of talking about, the marketplace as an innovation that helps us avoid the destructive aspects of this cycle. Strategic competition is a form of that. Rather than escalating into war, you find some other way to compete with this rival. And China is certainly positioned to fulfill that function. And further to that point, we are dealing domestically, and this is sort of another question to bring it back to politics, domestically in this country. I mean, to what extent it's true, I do think it's true, but also we tell ourselves that it's true, that the country has never been this divided. And we certainly see that level of internal divisiveness, and there's also internal scapegoating as well, and that's very destructive to the society. What do you think about that, about what's happening internally, and how does that fit into this theory?
Well, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on China, because what I'm seeing, and I think what I'm hearing from you, is like there's a couple different approaches that we can take to this particular situation with China. We can scapegoat China and try to, defeat them through various means, right? I mean, the most extreme one would be war, okay, if there's a conflict with Taiwan or something like that, and we sort of view the conflict that way. Or we can beat them through economic ways and in competitive ways. And if we're so kind of focused on the first way, we probably won't notice kind of economic threats and ways that are other things that we should be paying attention to. not just with security, but just like, are we actually like building better companies than China, right? Like what's going on there? So, I mean, that to me is like just a much sort of better use of our time than taking the kind of scapegoat route, because that's kind of the zero sum game. Like, I don't really know if that actually produces or gets us anywhere by doing that. Is that part of where you're going with that?
I think, part of where I would say disagree, just highlight a point of difference is that international relations, ultimately, global political stability undergirds the global economy. You can't build companies if you don't have political stability. A company is an artificial construction that comes out of a political system. And so I think the concern is that we really are. It's something that a lot of people, I think, unless you focus your attention on this issue and spend some time trying to really understand the nature of the CCP and this rivalry, I think it's hard to really appreciate how different our relationship to China is, and China and the nature of the CCP is, from what you and I may have thought it was in the early 2000s, right? This conception that China was just going to fold into the international order and they were going to compete on the global capitalist stage, and everything was just going to be measured in dollars. And I don't think that's the case. And because of the sorts of technologies that exist and where they're going in terms of automation and machine learning and artificial intelligence, there's a real risk that this escalates beyond anything that can be encapsulated within market competition. So when I talk about strategic competition, I don't exclude military competition, but what I'm suggesting is sort of open competition where things don't have to escalate to war. The danger is that things get to a place of open kinetic conflict when you don't have that sort of open strategic competition and you don't have systems and protocols in place to deal with it, right? You sort of bury it under the rug. You don't talk about it. And I think that's where we are currently. And again, cyber warfare is something we talked about on the show, and I don't want to take over the conversation here, but we saw recently the pipeline issue. We haven't established clear boundaries for what constitutes attacks. Attribution is difficult. It's just a very different world. But, to bring it back to the technology point, because this is something else that came up, and we've done episodes on this, I think most notably our episode with Shoshana Zuboff on surveillance capitalism, but we've covered it in many different ways. The tools for engineering desire are more powerful today than they've ever been before. How do those tools, and that's one way of talking about social media, how have these things exacerbated this mimetic cycle? And where are we seeing examples of that today? And how is that really dangerous?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I immediately think of TikTok, which, came out of China, as you say that. The engineering of desire is a fascinating concept, right? I mean, it's social media is doing things to our desires that we don't even understand, and we may not understand for a very long time. I think we need to start exploring that. When we talk about the effect that social media is having on us, Tristan Harris, Center for Humane Technology, they talk a lot about the sort of addictive properties, like, getting notifications on your phone is kind of like a slot machine because you get intermittent variable rewards. You never know what you're going to get. And it's really exciting to see. And there's no doubt that gives us dopamine hits and that there's some neurological and addictive things going on there. But I don't think we really understand what it's done on the level of mimetic desire. Like, we've now, I don't know, I mean, when you and I were in college, Facebook had just came out, I think, when I was a junior or senior. And NYU actually was one of the first schools to have it. So I remember.
So you and I graduated the same year, but I hadn't even heard of Facebook. I didn't know that it actually hit the NYU campus when I was there.
I think it did. I actually remember being in my dorm room as a senior, logging on for the very first time. I have this vivid recollection of it, actually, because I think shortly after it moved away from the Ivy Leagues, NYU was one of the first ones. And, up until that point, my kind of models, the people that I looked to were just the people in my school, like my friend group. And, what has it done that now we have access to these devices in our pockets where we can see what literally hundreds of millions, billions of people are doing or wanting around the world at all times.
Totally.
And there's kind of a flattening effect that's having. I think social media by its very nature has a conforming effect, right? I mean, just in the constraints of the technology itself, right? Like our profiles all kind of look the same. You know, your profile picture has to have these dimensions, and your tweets can only have so many characters. So I think it's actually made people on a global level more the same. And, you know, in Girardian terms, like we say familiarity breeds contempt, but similarity breeds contempt, because we have a fundamental need as humans to like differentiate ourselves. And I see there's like a real crisis of sameness going on that social media has created. And people are fighting viciously to differentiate themselves. I think that's part of why, I mean, studies have shown like people are more likely to make some extreme statement online about politics that they don't even believe. Like if you get a beer with them, you know, they'll be like, well, yeah, I shouldn't have said that. I don't really think it's quite like that. But like everybody has to, because if you don't, like nobody notices, right? There's like incentives. I mean, these social media platforms incentivize inflammatory, provocative behavior to get noticed, to get retweets and stuff. And I mean, I don't think that ends well. You know, a lot of people are trying to solve this problem that technology's created with just better technology and new social media platforms. I don't know if that's possible, to be honest. I'm a little bit of a pessimist on that. But I think that this is the hidden, overlooked effect, is what it's done in terms of forcing more conformity and making people react in these very strange ways.
That is absolutely fascinating, because indeed it is conforming, and yet I've never remembered people being so obsessed with superficial variance, with finding ways to signal their unique difference, whatever it is, whether it's gender, sexuality, race, or whether it is career, or whether it is something else. Everyone's so focused on individuation, and that has had real consequences on political cohesion and stability. So, I mean, I think that's absolutely fascinating. Luke, I'm going to move the second part of our conversation into the overtime. I want to continue this part of the conversation because it's something I've been thinking a lot about. And something else I wanted to ask you, since we both graduated the same year, is your qualitative experience of the last 10 years. It's something I talked about in a recent appearance on Grant Williams' podcast, which is that it feels to me like the last 10, in 2008, for example, when I looked back at the last 30 years of my life, until, you know, when I was born in the early 80s, the world felt pretty, I mean, yeah, there had been, things had changed, but I could relate to the world as it was in the 1980s and 2008. When I look back over the analogous period of time today, when I look at the 90s, it feels like a completely different world. I wonder sometimes if it happened the way that I remember it. It feels so fundamentally different. And in all the research I've done, I think I've come away with the view that something has fundamentally changed. You know, with the introduction of the iPhone, with hyperconnectivity, and all of these social media applications and these powerful algorithms that are constantly pinging us, moving us, prodding us, manipulating our wants and desires, I feel like we've entered into this world of the hyperreal. And it's something I want to ask you about. And that actually coincides well with something else that you talk about in the book. You talk about it in terms of Celebristan and Freshmanistan. Celebristan is the world that is outside of our sort of, I don't know, you'll have to explain it yourself, but it's sort of outside of what, anything that is sort of available to us. You know, if I think Gisele is really beautiful, I really have no shot at dating Gisele. I don't really know anyone that can introduce me to her. Also, she's married. And I'm happily married, by the way, just to be very clear. But I'm just using Gisele as an example because I think sexual desire is a really great example when it comes to this, because so many of the people that we desire, whether it's in Freshmanistan as a high school student, the girl that I think is the hottest girl in school, is she really the hottest girl in school? Would I normally be attracted to her if I saw her on an island without anyone else around? Probably not. But because everyone else desires her, or the rock star that everyone desires, you know? So you end up wanting her. There seems to be, again, because of social media and hyperconnectivity, Celebristan has become Freshmanistan. And so you have all these people that you follow, whose lives you look at, who are crushing it, and those people feel like they're within your circle of sort of desire of people. But they're really not, but they still feel like they are. So is that part of what's also happening? And it's causing a lot of internal conflict as well. I also want to talk about solutions and how to sort of transform this cycle of desire, because that's what the second half of the book is about. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second part of today's conversation with Luke, as well as the transcripts and rundowns to this episode and every other episode we've ever done, head over to hiddenforces.io and check out our episode library, or subscribe directly through our Patreon page at patreon.com/hiddenforces. There's also a link in the summary page to this week's episode with instructions on how to connect the Overtime feed to your phone so that you can listen to these extra discussions just like you listen to the regular podcast. Luke, stick around. We're going to move the second part of our conversation into the subscriber Overtime.
Great.
Today's episode of Hidden Forces was recorded in New York City. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to Overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Hidden Forces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.